We throw the word smart around all the time, but have you ever stopped to think about what it really means? Today we're going to dig into that and maybe even challenge what we think we know about being intelligent. Let's get right into it.
So to kick things off, I want you to join me in a little thought experiment. I'm going to introduce you to 3 different students. As you hear about them, just ask yourself, which one is the most intelligent?
Okay, first up, we've got Mahesh. He's the top of his class, a real whiz at math and science, though he kind of keeps to himself. His teachers are clear, he's an intelligent student. Then you have Rajni. Academically, she's described as average, but she's super friendly, gets along with absolutely everyone. Her teachers, though, they say she's not really intelligent. And finally, there's Raju. He's an incredible painter, just amazing with detail, but his grades are pretty average, and his teachers and parents aren't too thrilled about it.
So who'd you go with? If you're like most people, and honestly, like most of our education systems, you probably pointed right at Mahesh. And that gets right to the heart of the problem. We have this tendency to equate intelligence with just one thing, how well you do in school.
But why? Where did this idea even come from? To really get it, we need to take a quick trip back in time and see how we started trying to measure intelligence in the first place.
So, the whole thing started way back in the 1880s. You had guys like Francis Galton trying to measure intelligence through things like, get this, reflexes and grip strength. Then around 1900, Alfred Binet came along and shifted the focus. He created tests to measure mental abilities, specifically to help identify kids who needed extra help in school. And that was a huge deal, but it really locked in this connection between intelligence and doing well on school-related tasks.
And this quote right here is what really sealed the deal. In 1923, a psychologist named Edwin Boring came up with this definition. Think about it for a second. Intelligence is what intelligence tests measure. It's totally circular. It's like saying a good movie is a movie that wins an Oscar. It doesn't actually tell you what intelligence is, it just reinforces the idea that whatever the test measures, that's the whole story.
Which, of course, makes you wonder, is it? Is that really it? Is being good at taking tests the only way to be smart?
The answer, you'll be happy to hear, is a big, resounding no. Even early on, some thinkers knew that intelligence wasn't some single number you could pin on someone. It's way more complex, and frankly, a lot more interesting than that.
And one of the most important people in this whole conversation was the psychologist Edward Thorndike. He basically looked at this narrow focus and said, hold on, we're missing the bigger picture here. He was one of the first to propose a much more complete and, realistic framework.
Thorndike said, look, there are actually 3 main kinds of intelligence you see out in the world: abstract, social, and concrete. Let's break down what he meant by each of these.
First, you've got abstract intelligence. This is the one we're all familiar with. It's book smarts. It's the ability to work with ideas, symbols, and concepts. Think about solving a math problem or writing a paper on a complex topic. That's abstract intelligence in action.
And who does this sound like? Ding, 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 it's Mahesh. His incredible skill with numbers and scientific theories is a textbook example of high abstract intelligence. Our school system is built to find and reward this kind of smart.
Okay, next up is social intelligence. Thorndike described this as the skill of understanding and managing people and acting wisely in your relationships. It's all about people skills, right? Empathy, communication, reading a room.
And this is Rajni, 100%, that so-called average student. Her ability to connect with anyone, to build rapport, to make people feel comfortable, that's not just a personality quirk. That is a distinct and incredibly powerful form of intelligence that most tests completely ignore.
And the third type is concrete intelligence. This is about being smart with actual physical objects. It's hands-on intelligence. Think of a brilliant mechanic who can just listen to an engine and know what's wrong, or a surgeon, or an architect. It's practical, real-world problem-solving. And this, of course, is Raju. His amazing gift for painting, the way he can translate an idea into something real and beautiful with his hands and tools, that's a perfect example of concrete intelligence. He's brilliant in a way that, unfortunately, our traditional school system just doesn't know how to value. So, okay, we have these 3 types of intelligence. Why is this so important? Well, because when you start to see the world this way, it completely changes how you think about people's value, including your own. So let's circle all the way back to the beginning. Mahesh, the book smart one. Rajni, the people smart one. And Raju, the hands-on smart one. Who is the most intelligent?
By now, you've probably figured it out. It was a trick question. The real answer is, they all are. They're all highly intelligent. Mahesh has incredible abstract intelligence. Rajni has incredible social intelligence. And Raju has incredible concrete intelligence. They just speak different languages of smart.
So what's the big takeaway here? First, intelligence isn't one thing. It's a whole spectrum of abilities. Your grades are only one tiny piece of a much, much bigger puzzle. Those social and practical skills, they are not lesser than, they are valid, powerful forms of intelligence. And maybe the most important part is that when we start to appreciate this diversity, we can finally see the unique genius in everyone, and that includes ourselves.
So I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. Think about your own life, your own unique talents. What kind of intelligence do you have that no multiple choice test could ever hope to measure?
All right, today we're tackling one of the biggest, and let's be honest, most controversial ideas in psychology, the intelligence quotient. You've heard of it, right? IQ.
But here's the thing. Before we can even get to the numbers, the scores, all of that, we have to ask a much, much bigger question. What is intelligence? I mean, think about it. If you're going to measure something, you'd better know what that something actually is.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to try to pin down what intelligence even means. Then, we'll get into the tricky business of how you measure it. After that, we'll look at the classic IQ formula, see how a score is calculated, and finally, figure out what those numbers are actually supposed to tell us.
All right, first up, we're diving right into the heart of the problem, trying to find one single meaning for intelligence. And trust me, this is way trickier than it sounds.
So you had guys like David Wexler back in the day. He saw intelligence as this big, practical, all-around ability. It wasn't just about acing a test. For him, it was about how effectively you deal with the world around you, acting with purpose, thinking rationally, the whole shebang.
But then you had other folks like George Stoddard who had a different take. He was more interested in the brain's raw horsepower, the ability to tackle really difficult, complex, abstract stuff. It was all about mental heavy lifting.
So what you start to see is that even though the definitions are all over the place, some common ideas keep popping up. Things like intelligence being a mix of abilities, not just one thing. It's about being able to adapt. It's about thinking abstractly and solving tricky problems without wasting time.
And this is where the debate gets really wild. On one hand, you have someone like Thurston saying, hey, intelligence is maybe made up of 7 core abilities. But then on the other hand, you have Guilford coming in and saying, nope, try 150 different abilities. I mean, 7 versus 150, that's a huge difference. And it really gets to the core of the problem. Nobody could agree.
Which, leads us to the next massive problem. If the smartest people in the room can't even agree if we're talking about 7 things or 150 things, how in the world are you supposed to make a test that puts a single number on it?
This is where things took a really practical turn. A guy named Vernon basically said, look, let's stop arguing about the definition. He suggested we just focus on intelligence as a test score. In other words, who cares what intelligence is in the grand cosmic sense? Let's just define it as whatever this test measures. It's a clever way to sidestep the whole debate, right?
And really, this practical mindset goes way back. It all started in 1905 with Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon, who created the very first intelligence test. Over the years, other people, like Terman at Stanford, jumped in and kept tweaking and improving it. And that's basically how we ended up with a foundation for the IQ tests we still talk about today.
So the big question is, how did they do it? How did they take all this complex performance on a test and boil it down to one simple little number? Well, they came up with a formula that's actually pretty straightforward.
And here it is, the classic IQ formula. You take someone's mental age, divided by their chronological age, that's their actual age, and then you multiply that whole thing by 100. Simple as that.
Now the crucial part is getting what mental age and chronological age mean. Chronological age, easy. That's just how many birthdays you've had. But mental age is different. That comes from the test. It basically says you're performing at the same level as the average person of this age. So you could be 10, but have a mental age of 12.
Okay, that's the theory. Let's make it real. I'm going to walk you through a quick example so you can see exactly how this formula works.
All right, let's meet Vaishali. Her actual age, her chronological age, is 12. Now she takes an IQ test and she does really well. In fact, she performs at the level of an average 14-year-old, so that makes her mental age 14. Now we just pop those two numbers into our formula,
So we take 14, divide it by 12, and multiply by 100. And boom, we get an IQ score of 116.66. Okay, great, we have a number. But so what? What does 116.66 actually mean?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at how these scores were interpreted. To give the numbers some meaning, the early psychologists came up with a handy little classification chart.
Okay, now we have to talk about this chart, and this is super important. You have to look at this thing as a piece of history, a museum artifact. While we still kind of use concepts like average or superior, those terms at the bottom, moron, imbecile, idiot, those are absolutely 100% outdated. They were dropped a long, long time ago. And not just because they're obviously offensive, but because they're just not useful clinically. Modern psychology doesn't use these labels. Instead, it's all about statistics now. How far a score is from the average of 100.
So if we go back to our example and use this old chart, Vaishali's score of 116.66 puts her right in that 110 to 120 bucket, so she would be classified as above average.
And that brings us full circle, right back to that huge debate we started with. The IQ score, it was a practical fix for a really, really hard problem. But it leaves us with this one last giant question. If intelligence really is this incredibly complex thing, this tapestry woven from maybe 150 different threads, can a single number ever really tell the whole story about a person? That's something to think about.
Hey everyone, today we're going to dive into a word we all use, but maybe don't fully understand. Intelligence. We're going to explore what it really means to be smart, and trust me, it's about a whole lot more than just test scores and grades. So let's just get right to it. What does it actually mean to be smart? For the longest time, we've had a pretty narrow answer to that, but today we're going to blow that definition wide open. You know the stuff on the last, right? High test scores, straight A's, memorizing facts for an exam. That's what we're usually told intelligence looks like. But real life, well, real life is all about the stuff on the right. It's about adapting when things get thrown at you, solving messy, complicated problems, and, just figuring out how to get along with people. Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we first need to completely redefine what smart even is. We need to build a whole new foundation for this conversation. So check this out. This is a much better, much more practical way to think about it. Intelligence isn't just what you know, it's what you can do. It's how well you can adapt to your surroundings, how you learn from your mistakes, and how you tackle the actual problems that life throws your way every single day. So this new way of thinking about intelligence really breaks down into 3 key parts. The first one, we're going to call it the adaptive problem solver. This is the part of intelligence that gets its hands dirty. So what does an adaptive problem solver do? Well, they're not just good at acing a test. They can actually face down problems, from the easy ones to the really tricky ones. They can pivot when things change because they get the why behind things, not just the facts they were told to memorize. It's kind of like a chef who gets a mystery box of ingredients. They don't panic, they adapt, they figure out how things work together, and they create something amazing. That is this idea in action. And yeah, this right here, this says it all, doesn't it? True intelligence isn't something that stops after graduation. It's this ongoing, lifelong journey of pulling wisdom out of every single thing you go through, the good and the bad. Okay, so that was part 1. The second dimension, this is where things get really interesting. This part brings creativity and social skills together. We're calling it the creative connector. And you can see how all this stuff is linked, right? A creative connector doesn't just daydream new ideas, they make those ideas productive. They can look at an old concept and see a totally new angle, but they also get the unspoken rules of language and social cues, which is how they build real relationships. It's all about making connections between ideas and between people. All right, that brings us to our third and final piece of the puzzle, the critical thinker. This is the analytical, strategic part of intelligence that helps us make sense of a really complicated world. So how does this work in practice? Well, an intelligent decision is almost never just a gut feeling. It's a process. It starts with step 1. You have to look at a situation from every possible angle. Then, step 2, you start to analyze it, really pick it apart. And only then, after you've weighed all the options, do you get to step 3, making the final call. And I love this point because it gets at something huge. Reasoning isn't just about finding what's wrong with an idea. It's actually a creative process. When you question something, you open the door to coming up with something better. It's the engine that drives innovation. Okay, So we've just built this whole new, much bigger picture of what intelligence is. But you know what happens when you find a better answer, right? You almost always end up with even deeper, more interesting questions. But before we dive into those deep questions, let's just nail down the most important thing to remember from all of this. If you take away just one thing, let it be this. Intelligence is not one thing. It's this rich, multidimensional mix of how we adapt, how we create, how we connect, and how we think. Which, of course, gets you thinking, where does this stuff come from? Are some of us just born smart? How much of our intelligence is just baked into our DNA from the very beginning? And what about over a lifetime? Is the intelligence you have when you're 20 the same as what you'll have when you're 60? Or is this something you can actually build on, kind of like a muscle? Is it fixed? And that brings us right back to the beginning, doesn't it? Even with this bigger three-part view, we're still left with the ultimate question. Are we just talking about different sides of the same thing? Or are there actually many different types of intelligences out there? Something to chew on. Thanks for tuning in.
All right, let's talk about a word you probably use every single day: intelligence. Sounds simple, right? But what does it actually mean? This one word has sparked like a century of debate among some of the smartest people out there. So what is it really?
You know, we throw around words like smart or high IQ all the time, but what are we really talking about? Is it just knowing a ton of facts? Or is it about solving problems super fast? Maybe it's about being creative. Yeah, as you've probably guessed, this seemingly simple question, well, it doesn't have a simple answer.
For psychologists, asking what is intelligence is kind of like firing the starting gun at a race. It just kicks off this massive debate. There's no single agreed-upon definition. Nope. Instead, experts are pretty much split right down the middle into two big camps that see the whole thing from totally different perspectives.
Okay, so let's get right into it, because this is the great divide. On one side, you've got the factor theories. These folks are all about the what. What are the pieces, the ingredients, the basic building blocks that make up intelligence? Then, on the other side, you have the process theories, and they're like, forget the ingredients. We want to know how you cook. You know, how does your mind actually go about analyzing, solving, and understanding things? This is it. This is the heart of the whole debate. What versus how?
So let's start with camp number one. I like to call them the factor finders. These are the researchers who are convinced that intelligence isn't some mysterious cloud. They believe you can map it, you can identify its parts, and you can break it down. They're basically on a quest to find the fundamental building blocks of the human intellect.
The big idea here for this camp is that intelligence isn't just one thing. None at all. They see it more like a bundle of different separate abilities or factors. So you might be a rock star at one thing, like say verbal reasoning, but maybe not so hot when it comes to spatial awareness. And that's totally normal according to them.
And honestly, the absolute best way to get your head around this is to think of your intelligence as a toolbox, right? The factor theorists are basically trying to open up that toolbox and see what's inside. Is there a hammer for logic, a wrench for language skills, a screwdriver for spatial stuff? For them, it's all about what tools you have in your box.
And here are the big names, the master tool finders, if you will. It all started out pretty simple with Spearman. He suggested just a couple of main factors. But then guys like Thurston, Thorndike, and Guilford came along and were like, hold on, there are way more tools in here. They kept expanding the list. And this whole line of thinking really peaked with Howard Gardner and his famous theory of multiple intelligences. He basically argued we don't just have one toolbox, we have a whole garage full of them, for things like music, athletics, you name it.
All right, let's do a complete 180 and jump over to camp number two, the process people. For these thinkers, who cares how big your toolbox is? Seriously, it's irrelevant. What really matters is how good you are at using the tools you've got. It's not about what you have, it's all about how you use it. So you see the difference? These guys define intelligence not as a noun, but as a verb. It's an action. It's the active process of thinking. It's what your brain is literally doing, moment to moment, when you're trying to grasp a new idea or break down an argument or figure out a tough problem. It's totally dynamic, always in motion.
Okay, so if the factor camp sees a toolbox, the process camp sees a chef's technique. This is a great analogy. Think about it. You can give two chefs the exact same ingredients, but the one with the better technique, the one who knows just how to combine things, when to taste, how to adjust on the fly, that's the one who's going to make the amazing dish. It's all about your mental technique.
And this quote right here, it nails it. The goal for these folks is to basically map out your brain's flowchart. When you hit a problem, what are the actual steps you take in your head? How are you organizing the info? What strategies are you using? That, for them, is the real essence of intelligence.
A huge name in this camp is Robert Sternberg. His triarchic theory is a perfect example. He broke down the process of being smart into 3 key types: analytical, creative, and practical. See, just like the others in his camp, he was way less interested in what intelligence is and much more focused on what intelligence does.
Okay, I know, that was a lot of names and theories flying around. So how about we create a super simple memory trick to help you remember the key players from both sides of this debate?
It's super easy. Just 3 quick steps to lock these names in your memory for good.
All right, here they are, our 5 main thinkers. All we need to do is look at the first letter of each of their last names. We've got S, T, T, G, and another S.
And there you have it. Smart thinkers try great strategies. How perfect is that? It helps you remember Spearman, Thurston, Thorndike, Gardner, and Stinberg. And the best part, the sentence itself is about being smart.
Okay, so we visited these 2 huge opposing camps. Where does that leave us? Let's pull it all together and really zero in on the main takeaway from this whole what versus how debate.
So here's what you really need to remember. First, and this is a big one, intelligence isn't one single thing that everyone agrees on, not even close. Second, you've got the factor theories asking, what do you have in your toolbox? And third, you have the process theories asking, how good is your technique? And you know what? In the end, it's not about one being right and the other being wrong. They're both super valuable ways of looking at the incredible, complicated thing we call the human mind.
And all of this leaves us with one last giant question to chew on. If intelligence isn't just one thing, if it's both the tools in the box and the technique you use, then how on earth are we supposed to measure it, right? Should we just be counting the tools, or should we be tasting the final dish to see how good it is? That's something to think about.
Hey there, and welcome. Today we are tackling one of the biggest questions in psychology, one that we all think about. What in the world is intelligence? And to do that, we're going to go way back to one of the very first scientific theories that tried to pin it all down, Spearman's 2-factor theory.
Just think about it for a second. When you call someone smart, what do you actually mean? Are they a math genius, an amazing writer, a musical prodigy, or is there some kind of underlying general brain power that fuels all of those things? That is the exact puzzle that this theory tries to solve.
All right, here's our roadmap. We're going to set the scene, then we'll break down the 2 main ingredients in Spearman's theory, this G factor and the S factor. Then we'll see how they're supposed to work together. And finally, we'll talk about the legacy of this whole idea.
So, picture this. It's the early 20th century, and psychology is this buzzing new field. And everyone's asking, how can we actually measure and define this thing we call intelligence? Well, one guy stepped up with a really elegant idea.
And that guy was Charles Spearman. He's basically the father of a statistical method called factor analysis, which he used to hunt for patterns in people's test scores. He wasn't just throwing ideas out there, he was looking at the data and said, hey, I think intelligence is made of 2 basic parts.
Let's dive into the first part, the big one, the one that got everybody talking. Spearman called it the G factor, which is short for general intelligence. You can kind of think of it as the raw horsepower of your brain's engine.
So according to Spearman, this G factor is the absolute core of your intellect. It's the fundamental power source you tap into for pretty much any mental challenge, whether that's solving a Sudoku puzzle, learning a new language, or figuring out a tough problem at work.
Yeah, Spearman's term for it was mental energy. It's like some of us are born with a high wattage battery and others have a lower wattage one. He argued that this basic energy level impacts everything you do with your mind.
And this is where his idea gets pretty powerful and honestly a little controversial. Spearman argued that your G factor isn't something you learn, it's innate. You basically get it from your parents. Everyone has it, just in different amounts. And here's the kicker. He believed you couldn't improve it through school or practice. It's just the fixed foundation you have to build on.
Okay, so if G is the engine, what about everything else? Well, that brings us to the second piece of the puzzle, the S factor, which stands for all of our specific abilities.
These S factors are all the individual skills you pick up over a lifetime. Your skill in math, that's an S factor. How well you play the guitar, that's another S factor. Your knack for public speaking, yep, another S factor. These are all your learned talents.
And unlike that single G factor,
your S factors can be all over the map. I mean, we all know people like this, right? The brilliant coder who can't tell a joke to save their life, or the amazing artist who struggles with simple math. That's the S factor in action.
So this is the really important part. S factors are basically the polar opposite of the G factor. You can change them. You can get better at them. They're totally shaped by your education, how much you practice, and the world around you. You learn them. You're not just born with them.
All right, so we have this raw, innate mental energy. That's G. And all these skills we learn, that's S. So how do they actually come together when we, try to do something?
Well, Spearman's big idea was that you always need both. But he was super clear that there's a pecking order. He was convinced that your general intelligence, your G factor, was always the more critical piece of the puzzle.
Here's how he pictured it. You start life with whatever level of G factor you inherited. Then, through school and practice, you start building up all these different S factors. But, and this is the key, your G factor acts like a ceiling. It kind of determines the highest you can possibly go in any of those specific skills.
Now, where did he get this idea? It wasn't just some random thought. He spent years running his factor analysis on tons of test results, and he kept noticing this really persistent pattern.
He saw that people who scored really well on one kind of test, like, say, a verbal skills test, also tended to score well on a totally different kind of test, like one for math skills. To him, this positive link, this correlation, could only mean one thing. There had to be some common, general mental ability driving their performance across the board. That was his smoking gun for G.
So Spearman's theory was pretty neat. It was simple, it seemed to be backed by data, and it gave us a powerful way to think about intelligence. But maybe it was a little too simple.
And that's exactly what became the #1 criticism. I mean, the human mind is unbelievably complex. Can you really boil down the genius of an artist or the insight of a scientist to just 2 factors, where one of them is basically a fixed score you're born with?
Later researchers, like a guy named Lewis Thurston, really pushed back. He did his own studies and argued that no, intelligence isn't one general thing. It's more like a team of 7 primary mental abilities, stuff like memory, reasoning speed, and verbal skill. And yet, even with all the criticism, Spearman's idea was totally revolutionary. It really kicked off the whole scientific study of intelligence, and that core idea of a G factor is still being talked about and debated in psychology today.
So I'll leave you with this question to chew on. How do you see your own intelligence? Do you think of it as one single general ability that you apply to everything you do? Or is it more like a unique collection of different strengths and weaknesses? Spearman gave us a powerful place to start, but the debate he kicked off is far, far from over.
So what if I told you that a single number can't possibly define how smart you are? I mean, for decades, we've all been kind of ranked and sorted by one score. But what if our minds aren't just one single powerhouse? What if they're more like a super versatile toolkit, filled with all these different instruments for different jobs? Well, let's dive in and explore the 7 minds of intelligence. Think about it. You've probably taken some kind of test that spits out one score, a single number that's supposed to sum up your entire brain power. This one little number has shaped our schools, our jobs, everything for a really long time. But is that for real? Can something as complex and amazing as the human mind really be boiled down to just one number? For a long, long time, the answer to that question was a pretty firm yes. And that led to this powerful, really persistent idea of a single general intelligence, what we can basically call the one-score myth. Yeah, and the main theory was that there's this single, dominant ability. They even called it the G factor, that pretty much controlled how well you did on all intellectual tasks. So if you were good at one thing, say math, you were probably going to be good at everything else, because this one central power was running the whole show. But then, a psychologist named L.L. Thurstone came along and just completely turned this idea on its head. He proposed a radically different way of looking at our minds. Thurston's whole belief, his core idea, was that intelligence isn't just one thing, it's multidimensional. He argued that it's not a single peak, but more like a whole mountain range of different abilities. And this really shows you the difference. The old way of thinking said there was one dominant ability for everything, but Thurstone's theory, it proposed multiple, independent groups of skills. And that's the key difference, right? Being strong in one area doesn't automatically mean you're going to be a rock star in another. Thurston gave these core factors a name, primary mental abilities, or PMAs for short. You can think of a PMA as being like the main engine for a specific set of mental skills. It's the central pillar that supports a whole category of tasks, and the idea is that it operates pretty independently from all the other pillars. So, what are these independent pillars of our intellect? Well, Thurston's research didn't just stop at the idea. He actually went ahead and identified a specific set of primary abilities that he believed are the foundation of our intelligence. He identified 7 of them, not 1, but 7 distinct mental abilities that he thought were the fundamental building blocks of how we think, how we learn, and how we solve problems. And here they are: verbal meaning, word fluency, spatial ability, numeric ability, reasoning, memory, and even perceptual speed. See, each one is a different way of being smart. Someone might be an absolute genius at visualizing objects in space, but really struggle to find the right word in a conversation. Another person might have a lightning-fast memory, which is so crucial. It's like the mental filing cabinet that organizes information for all the other abilities to use, but maybe they take a little longer to see a logical pattern. Okay, I know, these names can sound a little academic, right? So let's make them real. How do these 7 abilities actually pop up in our everyday lives? Let's just break a few of these down. Verbal meaning, that's you being able to actually understand the instructions in a manual instead of just staring at them. Spatial ability is your mind's eye picturing how all the furniture is going to fit in a new room. Word fluency is that amazing knack for just finding the perfect word right in the middle of a conversation. And reasoning, that's that aha moment when you finally crack a really tricky puzzle. See? Each one is a distinct practical skill. But, of course, like any huge scientific theory, Thurston's work did not go unchallenged. In fact, it sparked a massive debate that is still shaping how we understand intelligence today. So the biggest pushback was that these abilities aren't truly independent. Studies started showing that people who are great in one area, like verbal skills, also tend to do pretty well in others, like reasoning. And because of that overlap, critics argued that Thurston hadn't really gotten rid of the G factor. He just found different flavors of it. And then the whole thing just exploded, with other theorists coming along and identifying as many as 150 different factors. But here's the real takeaway. Whether there are 7 abilities or 150, Thurston's work was a monumental shift. He's the one who forced us to stop looking for a single number and start appreciating the rich, colorful, amazing spectrum of human intellect. He opened the door to seeing our intelligence as a unique profile of strengths, not just some single data point. So that leaves us with one last question to chew on. Looking back at that list, verbal, spatial, reasoning, memory, which one of these 7 primary abilities do you think is your personal superpower? What's the go-to tool in your mental toolkit?
Have you ever felt that a single IQ score just doesn't quite capture what it really means to be smart? Well, if you have, you are definitely not alone. Today, we're diving into J.P. Guilford's groundbreaking structure of intellect theory. It's a model that completely shatters that old idea of a single intelligence and suggests, get this, you might have up to 150 distinct mental talents just waiting to be discovered.
Okay, so here's our game plan for unboxing this incredible idea. First, we're going to challenge that old notion that intelligence is just one number. Then, we'll break down the 3 dimensions of Guilford's model: the operations, the content, and the products of our thoughts. So stick with me, because by the end, we're going to build this entire cube of intellect and find out what it says about your personal cognitive superpowers.
All right, first things first. Let's really get into that big question that's at the heart of this entire theory.
You know, for the longest time, we've kind of been told that intelligence can be boiled down to a single number, right? Your IQ. But is that really the whole picture? I mean, are the skills of a brilliant composer, a genius engineer, and a charismatic CEO all just flavors of the same core intelligence? Or is something else going on?
Well, psychologist J.P. Guilford, he certainly didn't think so. See, while he was working with the Air Force, he had to figure out how to identify specific skills for really different roles. And that work led him to this radical idea. He basically said, hold on, intelligence isn't one thing at all. Instead, he proposed it's this complex, 3-dimensional structure made up of tons of separate abilities.
So let's start unboxing the first dimension of his model. This is all about the how of thinking. Guilford called them mental operations.
Think of operations like the different apps or tools your brain uses to get a job done. It's not what you're thinking about, but the specific mental action you're performing at that very moment.
Guilford identified 5 of these key mental tools. First up, you've got cognition. That's simply your ability to understand something, to get it. Then there's memory. Pretty straightforward, right? It's your brain's filing cabinet for storing and pulling out info. Next, we have divergent thinking. This is your creative brainstorming mode, coming up with lots of possibilities. Its total opposite is convergent thinking, where you zero in on finding that one single correct answer. And finally, there's evaluation. That's your internal fact checker, judging if something is correct or if it makes sense.
Okay, on to the second dimension, content. So if operations are how you think, content is what you're thinking about.
You can think of this as the raw material your brain is processing. It's the subject matter, the actual type of information that those mental tools are being used on.
And just like with operations, there are 5 categories here. You've got visual content, literally stuff you see, like a diagram or a friend's face. There's auditory content, which is anything you hear, from music to a conversation. Then we have symbolic content. That's all about abstract things like numbers in an equation or notes on a sheet of music. Semantic content deals with the meaning of words. And last, there's behavioral content. This is basically your social intelligence, your ability to understand people's actions, their moods, and what they might do next. And that brings us to the final piece of this whole puzzle, the third dimension, products. This is the output, the actual end result of your thinking process.
So here's how it works. You take a mental tool, an operation, you apply it to a certain type of information, the content, and bam, what you create is a product. It's the tangible outcome of that whole mental process.
Guilford found 6 kinds of results your brain can produce. You can create units, which are just single items of information. You can group those units into classes based on things they have in common. You can understand the relations between things, like cause and effect. You can grasp entire systems, seeing how all the different parts connect and work together. You can come up with transformations, which is like having a eureka moment and seeing something in a totally new way. And finally, you can understand implications, figuring out what happens next, the what-ifs, and the consequences.
Okay, we've got our 3 dimensions, the how, the what, and the final result. Now for the really cool part. Let's put this all together and see just how massive Guilford's model of intelligence really is. You ready?
So we start with those 5 basic ways your brain can process information.
And each one of those can be applied to 5 totally different types of content or information,
which can result in 6 different kinds of outputs. So what do you get when you multiply all of that together?
150. And according to Guilford, that is not just some random number. That is the number of distinct, separate, individual mental abilities that a person could have. Every single combination is its own unique talent. For instance, your ability to evaluate behavioral implications, to predict how someone might react, that's one. Your ability to remember visual units, like recalling faces from a crowd, that's another. 150 of them.
And this just perfectly captures Guilford's core idea. Intelligence isn't one big, clunky thing. It is, in his own words, a systematic collection of ability. It's the incredible sum of all these tiny, specific parts.
So let's bring this home. What does this giant 150-piece cube of intellect actually mean for you? What it means is that being smart is not a simple scale from low to high. You could be an absolute genius at divergent thinking with symbolic content, which would make you a brilliant mathematician, but maybe you find it harder to evaluate behavioral content, and someone else might have the exact opposite profile. Your intellect is this incredibly unique profile of strengths and weaknesses across all 150 of these abilities. It's as unique as your fingerprint.
This model just completely reframes the entire conversation about intelligence. So instead of asking, how smart are you? The real question becomes, how are you smart? It suggests every single one of us has a unique cognitive toolkit. So it leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. Out of all these 150 possibilities, what's your intellectual superpower?
You know, for the longest time, the idea of being smart felt like this simple one-size-fits-all thing, right? You either had it or you didn't. But what if intelligence is way more complex, more personal, and a whole lot more interesting than just a single score? Well, today, we're going to unlock Howard Gardner's groundbreaking theory of multiple intelligences, which totally flipped the script on how we answer the question, how are you smart?
So let's just start right there with that big question. What does it actually mean to be smart? I mean, for most of us, that word probably conjures up images of good grades, super high test scores, academic stuff. But is that really the whole story? For sure. The traditional view pretty much boiled intelligence down to a single IQ score.
It was all about academic skill. But then, back in 1983, a psychologist named Howard Gardner comes out with his book, Frames of Mind. And he proposes this radical new idea, that we don't just have one single intelligence, but a whole blend of diverse and totally distinct abilities.
Okay, so let's dive into Gardner's original framework. This is where it all started, with the initial 7 intelligences he identified.
Gardner's original 7 covers such an incredible range of human talent. I mean, you've got the classic book smarts, right? Linguistic and logical mathematical intelligence. But then he identified others, like spatial intelligence, the kind an architect or a designer uses. There's body kinesthetic, which is the genius you see in dancers and athletes, and musical, for people who think in pitch and rhythm. Then you have interpersonal, that's the ability to just get other people, and intrapersonal, which is all about deep self-knowledge.
Now here's a really key idea. Gardner said these intelligences are semi-autonomous. What does that mean? Well, basically, they're largely independent of each other. It's why, for example, brain damage might mess with one ability but leave the others completely untouched. It explains how someone can be an absolutely brilliant musician but maybe not a math whiz, or a world-class athlete who isn't a great writer. Your strengths in one area don't automatically mean you'll be strong in another.
But here's the cool part. Gardner's work didn't just stop in 1983. This was a living, breathing idea, and it evolved, eventually growing beyond those original 7.
So for years, the entire conversation was built around these 7 types of smarts. But Gardner and other researchers, they started to feel like the picture wasn't quite complete yet. Was something missing?
And that's when he officially added an 8th one, naturalistic intelligence. This is that incredible ability to recognize, categorize, and just appreciate the natural world. You know, plants, animals, the environment as a whole. Think of a biologist, a skilled farmer, or really anyone with that deep, intuitive connection to the living world. This addition was a huge deal, because it officially expanded the idea of smart beyond skills that are purely human-centric or abstract.
And the evolution didn't even stop there. A 9th intelligence called existential intelligence was also put on the table. This is our capacity to grapple with those huge, deep questions about human existence, like the meaning of life, of death, our place in the cosmos. Now, Gardner himself was a little cautious about fully including it, but it just goes to show you how far this concept of intelligence could be stretched.
Okay, so we have this fantastic framework of 8, maybe even 9 different intelligences. But beyond the cool theory, why does any of this actually matter? What's the real-world power of looking at things this way?
This quote from the source material just hits the nail on the head. This theory gives us a language, a way to understand human complexity. It helps explain how a person who is academically brilliant might really struggle socially. It's not some personal failing, it's just a different balance, right? Maybe they're high in logical, mathematical intelligence, but lower in interpersonal intelligence. It makes sense.
Gardner was also really clear about what intelligence is for. It's not about passing tests. It's about practical, real-world application. It's for solving problems in your day-to-day life. It's for creating things that your culture actually values, whether that's a piece of music or a new app. And it's for producing new knowledge. It's supposed to be an active, contributing force in the world.
But here's the thing you absolutely have to remember. The point of this theory was never to put people into boxes. The real goal is to empower learners. It's a tool to help us see our own unique strengths and figure out how to build on them, not to slap a label on ourselves or anyone else.
All right, let's bring all this back home. How does this apply to you? Let's turn that lens around and think about your own personal blend.
It all really boils down to this one powerful shift in thinking. The whole theory moves the question away from how smart are you and toward a much better one, how are you smart? Every single one of us has a unique mixture, a personal profile of all these different intelligences, and recognizing that blend, that's the real key to unlocking your potential.
So, I'll leave you with this to think about. Are you a poet who also has an amazing green thumb? A logical thinker with a gift for connecting with people? What's the specific combination of these intelligences that makes you, you? Take a second and really consider it. What's your unique intelligence blend?
Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to completely tear down the old school idea of what it means to be smart. We're going to look at a really cool model that shows us intelligence is so much more than just a grade on a test.
So let me just ask you this straight up. What does being smart actually mean to you? Is it about acing exams, solving riddles? Because, you know, for the longest time, that's kind of been the whole story. But it's a pretty narrow view, right?
I mean, we've all been taught to think about intelligence as this one single thing you can measure with a score, like an IQ test. But that just feels wrong, doesn't it?
It totally misses all the other ways people are brilliant. Like, how do you measure the genius of someone who can walk into any room and make friends? Or someone who can invent a solution out of thin air? A test just can't capture that stuff.
And that's exactly where the psychologist Robert Sternberg comes into the picture. Way back in 1985, he wrote this game-changing book called Beyond IQ. And he basically said, hold on, we're thinking about this all wrong. Intelligence isn't something you have, it's something you do.
So for Sternberg, intelligence is really all about the mental gears turning in your head. It's the process you use to make sense of the world and figure out how to thrive in it. Think of it like a mental toolkit you're using constantly to adapt and succeed, no matter where you are. It's not fixed, it's totally active.
Okay, so what does that process actually look like? Well, Sternberg broke it down into 5 steps we all go through. First, you encode. You figure out what information actually matters. Then you infer what it all means. Next, you map it, connecting it to stuff you already know. From there, you figure out the application, how to use that insight, and finally, you come up with a response, the best possible solution. We do this for everything, from a huge work project to just figuring out the quickest way to the grocery store.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Sternberg realized this whole mental process shows up in 3 totally different ways, and those 3 ways make up his famous triarchic theory.
And these aren't just, abstract concepts. These are 3 concrete subtheories that get to the heart of how we actually use our smarts out there in the real world. Each one shines a light on a different way we interact with everything around us.
And boom, here they are. You've got practical intelligence, which you can just think of as street smarts, that common sense ability to get things done. Then there's creative intelligence, or innovative smarts, how you come up with new ideas. And finally, analytical intelligence, which we all know as book smarts, the kind of thinking you do in school. The thing is, we all have a mix of these, but usually one of them is our go-to.
So, let's really dig into each of these. Think of this as opening up your personal intellectual toolkit and seeing what's inside. We'll start with the one you probably use every single day without even thinking about it.
All right, first up, practical intelligence. This is all about getting by and thriving in your day-to-day world. It's about having that gut feeling for what works in a given situation. This is the superpower of that person who just gets people, or the entrepreneur who can navigate any tricky business deal.
And Sternberg says we use our street smarts in 3 ways. Sometimes you adapt. You change yourself to fit the situation, like learning the ropes at a new job. Other times you shape the environment to fit you, like when you suggest a better way of doing things at work. And if those don't work, you use selection. You just find a new environment, like leaving a job that's a bad fit.
Next, we have creative intelligence. This is how you handle different situations, especially new ones. It's that spark that lets you connect 2 unrelated ideas to create something totally new. It's the artist's vision, the inventor's breakthrough moment.
What's really cool is that creative intelligence has 2 sides. On one side, you have novelty. This is when you're thrown into a brand new situation and have to figure it out on the fly. But on the other side, you have automation. This is when you've done something so many times it becomes second nature, like a pro athlete making a perfect shot. That frees up your brain to think about the bigger picture.
And last but not least, we've got analytical intelligence. This is the book smarts we're all so familiar with. It's your ability to analyze, to compare and contrast, to evaluate arguments. This is what traditional IQ tests are really good at measuring, and it's what schools tend to reward the most. Sternberg has this great way of thinking about it. It's like you have a little CEO running things in your mind. The meta components are the CEO, the planner who sets the strategy. The performance components are the employees, the doers who actually execute the plan. And the knowledge acquisition components are like your research and development department, always learning new things to help the whole operation run better. So now that we've looked at all 3, let's bring this all back home. Because here's the most important takeaway. None of us is just one of these things. We're all a unique cocktail of practical, creative, and analytical intelligence. And understanding your personal mix is the key.
Think about it for a second. The street-smart doer, the innovative thinker, the logical analyst. Which of those feels the most like you? Are you the person who can always find a practical solution? Or the one who's always coming up with wild new ideas? Or are you the one who loves taking a complex problem and just breaking it all down?
At the end of the day, what Sternberg's theory really teaches us is that intelligence isn't some fixed score you're stuck with. It's a dynamic, flexible toolkit. The people who really succeed in life aren't always the ones with the highest book smarts, but the ones who know their own strengths, whatever they may be, and know exactly how to use them. So the real question isn't, how smart are you? It's how are you smart?
Okay, so we've all heard of IQ scores, right? But have you ever really stopped to think about what they actually mean? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the whole world of intelligence testing. We're going to get into how psychologists even try to measure, well, the mind itself. Let's dive in. And right away, you run into this huge problem. I mean, intelligence isn't like your height or weight, is it? You can't just grab a measuring tape and get a number. It's this abstract idea. So the big question is, how on earth did anyone even begin to try and put a number on something as complex as the way we think? So you might think the first step is to just start writing questions for a test. But nope. Before they could do any of that, they had to tackle an even bigger question. What even is intelligence? Because think about it, without a solid definition, any test you make is basically just a shot in the dark. You've got to know what you're aiming for. So let's see what they came up with. This definition right here from the psychologist David Wexler, this is basically our North Star for this whole conversation. And what's really interesting is what it's not about. It's not about how many facts you can memorize. It's really about three things: acting with a purpose, thinking rationally, and dealing with whatever your environment throws at you. It's all about practical, real-world, adaptable intelligence. And this one idea really shapes every single test we're about to talk about. All right, so with that definition locked in, we can finally start to organize the, huge variety of tests that are out there. And it turns out you can pretty much sort all of them using a surprisingly simple two-part system. So the first big divide is super straightforward. Is it a one-on-one test, or is a whole group taking it at once? Individual tests are exactly what they sound like, just you and the examiner. You see these a lot in clinical settings or for testing young kids. They're super thorough, but man, they take a lot of time and can be really expensive. On the other hand, you've got group tests. These are all about efficiency. Think about testing an entire school or a bunch of military recruits. You can test a ton of people all at once, which makes them way cheaper and easier to manage. Okay, so that's the how many. The second way to classify them is all about what kind of stuff is on the test. You've got verbal tests, which, yeah, pretty obvious. They use language. They're built around words and numbers to ask questions and pose problems. But what happens if the person taking the test speaks a different language or maybe has a reading disability? That's where nonverbal tests are absolutely key. They get rid of the words and use things like pictures, puzzles, and hands-on activities to assess intelligence. No shared language required. Now, here is where it all clicks into place. When you take those two classifications, individual versus group and verbal versus nonverbal, and you combine them, you create this really clean, simple grid that maps out every type of intelligence test there is. And boom, there it is. See how that works? Every single intelligence test out there is going to fall into one of these four boxes: individual verbal, individual nonverbal, group verbal, or group nonverbal. It really is that simple. Let's run through a quick example from each one so you can see what I mean. Okay, starting in that first quadrant, we have individual verbal tests. A classic example is the Binet-Simon test. This is that classic scenario where it's just one examiner and one person, and they're going through a series of language-based questions to get a sense of their cognitive skills. All right, let's hop over to the next box. Individual nonverbal. You'll often hear these called performance tests, and that's a great name for them because the focus completely shifts from just answering questions to actually doing stuff. A test like the Bhatia battery is all about hands-on puzzles and tasks. It's the perfect tool when language might be getting in the way. Now we're getting into territory that probably feels pretty familiar to a lot of us: group verbal tests. These are the kinds of things you might have taken in school. They're a total staple in education and even in some workplaces. A test like the one developed by S.M. Mosen can be given to a whole classroom or company department at once, using words and numbers to assess the group efficiently. And that brings us to our last box: group nonverbal tests. Now, these are super, super important when you need to test a massive group of people who might not all speak the same language. The Army Alpha test is a famous example. It was designed to evaluate the problem-solving skills of a ton of new recruits all at the same time, but by using patterns and puzzles instead of words. Okay, so we've got this nice, tidy little system, but so what? Why does it matter how these tests are categorized? Well, it matters a lot. Because each one of these test types is like a specific tool built for a very specific job. And those jobs, they can have a massive impact on people's actual lives. I mean, the real-world applications here are vast. These tests are used to identify gifted kids who are bored in class and need a bigger challenge. And, just as importantly, they help find students with learning disabilities who need extra support. The results can influence everything from academic predictions and career guidance to who might get a scholarship. They are powerful diagnostic tools that can shape an individual's entire educational journey. So, we've seen how intelligence is defined, classified, and applied. These tests give us a snapshot of a person's ability to think rationally and solve problems, but it leaves us with this one big, lingering question. They can tell us a lot about the how of our minds, but can a test ever truly capture the why, the creativity, the motivation, and the curiosity that also define what it means to be intelligent? Something to think about.